Hey, my name is Connor Walker. I'm 35 years old, and I live by myself on a small ranch about 20 minutes outside the nearest town in Montana. It's nothing like those massive spreads you see in films. Just a few hundred acres of dry pasture, a modest herd of cattle, a few goats, a chicken coop, an aging barn, an old Ford pickup that's already crossed 200,000 miles. I'm not wealthy. I'm not even what most folks around here would call a proper rancher. I'm just a man who wakes up before sunrise, repairs fences, feeds the animals, and does whatever it takes to keep everything from falling apart. 3 years ago, my wife Maria died in a sudden flash flood. A calf had gotten trapped near the creek behind the barn during a heavy storm. I had gone into town to pick up veterinary supplies. She went out alone to save it. By the time I made it back, the water had already taken her. Since that day, life has been quiet in a way that doesn't feel peaceful. I still work. I still pay my bills. I still run the ranch. But most days, it feels like I'm just going through motions inside a place that stopped being a home the night she never came back. That October night, the rain was coming down hard. The wind kept slamming the barn door against its frame. I had just finished checking on the cattle and was heading inside to make coffee when I heard a knock. It wasn't a normal knock. It was weak, rapid, almost desperate. I opened the door, and there she was, a young girl standing on my porch. She looked about 25. Dark hair stuck to her face, a thin jacket completely soaked through, jeans covered in mud up to her knees. She had a small backpack in one hand and a plastic folder in the other. She was shaking from the cold, but it wasn't just the weather that caught my attention. It was her eyes. Not just fear of the rain or the dark, but the look of someone who had been running for a long time and wasn't sure she'd be allowed to stop. She looked straight at me, lips trembling. "Are you Connor Walker?" I frowned slightly. "Yeah, who are you?" She swallowed hard, her voice barely louder than the storm. "They sent me here to be your wife." I stood there for a moment, convinced I had misheard her. "What did you say?" She repeated it, clearer this time, but still trembling. "They said you signed the agreement, that you requested a wife for the ranch, that I was supposed to come." I studied her carefully, half confused and half alert. I had never signed anything like that. I hadn't even thought about a relationship since Maria died. And yet here stood a complete stranger on my porch during a storm, claiming she'd been sent to marry me. I spoke slowly. "There's a mistake. I never signed any agreement." She stepped forward slightly, panic rising in her face. "Please don't send me back. I can't go back there. If I return, he'll destroy me." The way she said it made me stop, questioning for a second. I glanced past her into the darkness of the dirt road. No car, no footsteps, no one else. Just wind, rain, and mud. How did you even get here? I hitched a ride with a truck to a gas station off the highway, and then I walked. From that gas station to my ranch was nearly 8 miles. In the rain, at night, wearing shoes that were already falling apart. Then I noticed something else. Bruises on her wrists. A faint purple mark just under her collarbone, barely hidden by the edge of her jacket. Anger tightened in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. "Come inside. You can't stay out there." She stepped in quickly, like she was afraid I might change my mind. I shut the door behind her and locked it. The house was small, an old ranch-style place where the living room flows straight into the kitchen. A wood stove in the corner, a worn table with 2 chairs, one main bedroom, and a storage room full of tools. Nothing had really changed since Maria died. Her rocking chair still sat near the window with an old wool blanket folded over it. The girl stood close to the stove, wrapping her arms around herself. "My name is Elena Mendoza," she said quietly. "I'm sorry for showing up like this." I grabbed a dry towel and handed her one of my old flannel shirts. "Get out of those wet clothes. Bathroom's down the hall. Then you'll tell me what's going on." About 10 minutes later, she returned wearing my flannel over a thin shirt. Her hair was still damp, but her face had regained a bit of color. I poured her a cup of hot tea and set it on the table. She held it with both hands, like warmth itself had become rare. I asked again, "Who sent you?" Her eyes dropped to the folder in her hands. "Richard Salazar." I knew the name instantly. Everyone in the area did. He owned the feed store, the trucking company, and a large portion of the land deals in the county. Wealthy, connected, powerful enough to keep small ranchers like me dependent on him. I didn't like him, but I still bought supplies from his store. There wasn't much choice. I don't deal with him directly, I said. Just feed and supplies. That's it. Elena opened the folder and pulled out a printed document. My name was on it. My ranch address was on it. Even a signature that looked exactly like mine. She placed it in front of me. He said you paid for me to come here. That my family owed him, and I was the repayment. A cold weight settled in my stomach. I picked it up. It was printed on thick paper with a fake-looking company header at the top. Something like Agricultural Partner Services. The document stated that I, Walker, had agreed to accept Elena Mendoza as a live-in partner and ranch assistant in exchange for $50,000 already placed in escrow. At the bottom, my signature, except I had never signed it, and I had never seen $50,000 in my life. I set the paper down slowly, forcing my anger down. The signature was too perfect. Someone had clearly copied it from old invoices or delivery slips I'd signed over the years. The wording was careful. It never openly said purchase. It disguised her as a domestic and labor arrangement under a legal-sounding agreement. I tapped the paper. I never signed this. Elena closed her eyes, as if she had already expected that answer. Then she told me everything. Her father had owned a small vineyard and family winery in Oregon. After he died in what looked like a suspicious trucking accident, she discovered massive debt tied to Richard Salazar. The loan documents carried her father's signature, but she believed they were forged. Salazar took the property, forced asset liquidation, froze accounts, and paid off local officials. When Elena resisted, things escalated. He pressured her, threatened her, tried to make her his personal possession. When she refused, he told her she had nothing left and arranged for her to be sent to me instead. I asked quietly, "Why me?" She shook her head. "I don't know, maybe because you live alone. Maybe because no one really listens to people out here. Maybe because he needed someone easy to control." Her voice tightened. "If you accept me, he is proof I came willingly. If you refuse, I have nowhere to go. Either way, he wins." Silence filled the room. She sat there exhausted, trembling, but still holding herself together, and something inside me shifted. I thought grief had stripped me of everything that mattered after Maria died, but watching the stranger being cornered like livestock, I realized I wasn't as empty as I believed. I spoke finally. "You're staying here tonight. I'll take the couch. Tomorrow we figure this out." Elena stared at me like she couldn't process it. "You believe me?" "I believe your wrists," I said. "I believe the way you shake when you say his name." And I recognized my own signature. Her eyes filled with tears, but she tried to hold them back. "Thank you, Connor." I didn't respond right away. Outside, the rain kept hitting the roof. Inside me, something had already changed, and I wasn't sure I could turn it back. After we finished eating, I opened up my old laptop and scanned the contract, then reached out to Grace Miller. Grace was a small-town attorney who had handled my insurance claims and property paperwork after Maria passed away. She was the only legal person in the county I actually trusted. I forwarded her the file. About an hour later, she called back. "Hey, Ace," she said, her tone already serious. "Connor, the signature looks close enough to yours, but there are too many inconsistencies here. The way this contract is written is intentionally vague. It's not strong enough to legally bind you to keep her, but is enough for Salazar to create problems, damage your reputation, or push a civil case if he wants to." I leaned forward. "Can we take this to the police?" "You can, but you already know who the sheriff is aligned with," she replied. "If you want to make this matter stick, you'll need solid proof, evidence that he forged documents, pressured her, and that it connects back to her family's land situation." I glanced across the table. Elena was sitting perfectly still, listening to every word. Her face had gone pale. Grace continued, "Just keep her safe. Don't sign anything else. Don't let Salazar get access to her. And Connor, be careful. Men like Richard Salazar don't take rejection lightly." That afternoon, a black SUV rolled down my dirt road. I was outside repairing the wind barrier around the cattle pen. Elena stayed inside, watching from behind curtains. The SUV stopped right in front of the house. And then Richard Salazar stepped out. In person, he looked even worse than I remembered. Mid-50s, expensive jacket, spotless shoes that didn't belong in mud country, silver hair perfectly combed back. He always carried that calm, polished smile like he was quietly calculating the worth of everything he saw. A younger man stayed behind the wheel. Salazar walked toward me. I wiped my hands on my jeans and stepped forward, blocking his view of the house. "Connor Walker," he said smoothly. "Finally meet you in person." I kept my tone flat. "What do you want?" He smiled lightly. "Just checking if Miss Mendoza arrived safely. I assume you're satisfied with the arrangement." I didn't blink. I didn't sign anything. I didn't receive any payment. And Elena is not a transaction. His smile stayed, but his eyes hardened. "You should be careful, Connor," he said calmly. "I have documents. I have witnesses. You're just a small rancher with cattle, debt, and very little influence." I stepped closer. "You forged my signature. That's fraud." "And you're making accusations," he replied, tilting his head. "Very dangerous ones." He glanced toward the window where Elena stood watching. "She has a habit of telling stories," he added. "Just like her father. Always a victim in every situation." My jaw tightened. "Get off my land." He gave a short, dismissive laugh. "You really want to turn me into an enemy?" "I'm not turning you into anything. You're doing that yourself." Salazar leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You buy feed from my store. You have loans tied to banks I influence. Your cattle are transported through companies connected to me. You're not independent. You're just comfortable believing you are." I didn't move. "Then cut me off," I said. For the first time, his smile faded completely. He turned toward the SUV, then paused before getting in. "She's going to bring you nothing but problems," he said coldly. "And when this place starts collapsing, remember who gave you the choice." The vehicle drove off, leaving fresh tire tracks carved into the mud. Elena rushed outside moments later. "You shouldn't have confronted him," she said quickly. "He's going to retaliate." I looked at her. "Maybe he will," I said, "but I'm not handing you over." She studied me carefully. "Why would you risk everything for me?" I didn't have a perfect answer, not one that made sense on paper. Finally, I said, "Because it felt wrong not to, because Maria wouldn't have stayed silent, and because for the first time in years, I felt like I could actually stand for something again." I paused, "because no one should ever be treated like property." That night, the retaliation began. The next morning, I walked out to check the chicken coop and found the door wide open. More than half the flock had scattered across the yard. The hinges hadn't broken. They had been deliberately unscrewed. Elena and I spent the entire morning chasing chickens through wet grass and mud. She slipped more than once, but kept getting up, arms full of flapping birds. At one point, I couldn't help but laugh. She shot me a glare. "This is not funny." "Sorry," I said. "That one just looked like it was winning." She looked down at the chicken in her arms, then suddenly laughed too. It was brief, but real, and it echoed across the empty yard like something the ranch hadn't heard in years. By the afternoon, things got worse. The eastern fence line had been cut clean through. 2 cows had wandered into the neighboring property. Fresh ATV tracks marked the ground near the breach. No one was caught. No one was seen. But the message was obvious. Salazar didn't need to take Elena by force anymore. He could slowly break everything around us until there was nothing left to stand on. That evening, we sat at the kitchen table eating canned soup and toast. Elena put her spoon down first. "I should leave," she said quietly. I set mine down too. "No. If I stay, he'll destroy your life," she insisted. "I can fix fences," I replied. "I can replace animals. I can deal with suppliers. But if you go back to him, you won't be able to fix what he does to you." She lowered her head. Tears fell onto her hands. "I don't want you losing everything because of me." I looked around the kitchen. The worn table I built myself, the faded walls Maria once painted, the floorboard scratched from years of living. This place wasn't perfect. It wasn't even peaceful anymore, but it was still mine. And for the first time, it meant something bigger than just survival. If this place has to take hits so someone else can stand back up, I said quietly, then maybe it finally has a purpose. Elena didn't answer, but she didn't mention leaving again either. The following days looked calm on the surface, but tension stayed under everything. Salazar didn't return in person, but his influence spread quietly. The feed store suddenly claimed account issues and refused my orders. My regular livestock hauler was suddenly booked for weeks. A tractor part shipment was canceled without explanation. Then one night, my security camera caught a shadowed figure near the fuel tanks, but the truck's plate was smeared with mud. That's when I changed everything. I started driving farther just to buy basic supplies. I installed motion lights around the barn and house. I borrowed extra cameras from Mr. Coleman, the retired firefighter who lived nearby. Grace had warned me, people like Salazar don't just break things, they erase systems. So I moved every important document onto a secure cloud drive, and Elena changed too. At first, she didn't even know the difference between fresh hay and spoiled feed. She didn't know how to latch the cattle gates or handle a truck on gravel roads without sliding, but she learned quickly. I showed her everything. Feeding routines, water checks, animal signs, basic repairs, fencing. The first time she tried milking a goat, it kicked the bucket over and soaked her completely. I laughed. She glared at me. It's not funny. Kind of is, I said. Then she started laughing too. And for a moment, the war outside didn't exist. She said quietly, I never thought I'd be happy about spilled milk. I replied, out here, that still counts as progress. From that day, she started waking up before sunrise with me. She made coffee while I checked weather reports. She wrote daily tasks on the kitchen board. At night, she worked through old records on my laptop. Her father's loans, Salazar's company's land transfers. She had studied business before everything collapsed, and it showed. Where I saw confusion, she saw patterns. One night, everything shifted. We were sitting at the table surrounded by papers when she froze. In the land records tied to her family's property, she found something unexpected. A shell company called Northline Holdings. It had purchased the land shortly after her father's death at a suspiciously low price. And that company was linked to the same investment group that had given me a loan 2 years earlier to repair my barn. I stared at the screen. A cold weight dropped into my chest. So this wasn't random, I said. Elena shook her head. No, he chose you. She tapped the screen. He knew your debt. He knew your situation. He knew this place was vulnerable. I leaned back slowly. My ranch wasn't just land anymore. It was part of a plan. At the same time, the sabotage escalated. The water pump wires were cut clean through one morning. If I hadn't caught it early, the cattle would have gone without water all day. Another time, a barrel of diesel was knocked over inside the barn. It didn't ignite, but the smell soaked into the wood for days. Everything was closing in, and Elena finally broke. This is happening because I came here, she said. I was under the pump system, hands covered in grease. I looked up at her. No, I said firmly. This is happening because he's trying to take everything. Then I added quieter. And even if you hadn't come, he would have found another way. You just made me see it sooner. She went quiet after that, then slowly crouched down and handed me the roll of electrical tape, without saying another word. That night, she asked me about Maria. I had avoided speaking about Maria for 3 years. Every time I tried, it felt like something inside me would break again. But sitting there next to Elena, it didn't feel like reopening a wound anymore. It felt like sharing something I had been carrying alone for too long. So I told her how Maria used to sit in that old rocking chair by the window, always reading something she barely finished. How she insisted on planting tomatoes every spring, even though the rabbits destroyed half of them every time. How she would hum softly while washing dishes, like the kitchen was its own little world. Then I told her about the night everything ended, the storm, the calf stuck near the creek, the rising water, the call that never got answered in time. And finally, finding her scarf tangled on the fence downstream. Elena quietly placed her hand over mine. You didn't kill her, Connor. I gave a tired, empty half-smile. People say that a lot. I'm not saying it to comfort you, she said softly. I'm saying it because it's true. Bad things happen, but the ones left behind end up punishing themselves for everything. Those words stayed with me longer than I expected. I looked at her under the dim kitchen light. Her hair was loosely tied back, her hands marked with small cuts from fence repairs, her face tired but calmer than before. The woman who had once stood shaking on my porch in the storm was no longer the same person. She was grounding herself. And I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think before. I didn't just want to protect her. I wanted her near me. I wanted her laughter in the yard. I wanted her presence in the kitchen in the mornings. I wanted life in this place again. Before I could say any of it, a sharp blast echoed outside. We both ran out immediately. The barn wasn't burning, but smoke was pouring out of the electrical panel. Someone had intentionally tripped the main breaker from outside. The lights across the animal pens went dark. The security system went offline in seconds. Elena stood beside me, face pale. "He wants you panicked," she said. I stared at the barn, then out toward the dark fields beyond it. "No," I said quietly. "He wants me angry enough to make a mistake." "So what do we do?" she asked. I turned to her. We stop reacting. We start building a case. We gather real proof, not just about the sabotage, but everything he's built his power on. Elena took a deep breath. "There might be something that helps." She told me her mother had hidden a hard drive and a stack of documents before she died. Her father had already suspected Salazar was involved in forged contracts, illegal land transfers, and money laundering through supply companies. Her mother had copied everything. But after the family lost the property, their home in Oregon was taken over and eventually sold to a company tied back to Salazar. Elena wasn't sure the evidence was still there, but she knew exactly where it had been hidden, under loose floorboards in her father's old office. I asked her, "Is the house being watched?" "Probably," she said. "Cameras, maybe even security. But they don't expect me to ever go back." I nodded slowly. "Then we don't rush him blind. We do this properly." I called Grace, after reviewing everything. She said if Elena still had a legal claim and there was a chance the property contained criminal evidence, we could involve state investigators or the district attorney. But they would need a solid package. Clear sabotage evidence, the forged contract, financial links, and surveillance proof. Elena looked at the growing stack of documents on the table. For the first time since she arrived, fear wasn't what I saw in her eyes. It was determination. "So we build a case," she said. I nodded. "We build it." That night, we worked until the early hours of the morning. I gathered camera footage, photos of broken fences, canceled supply orders, and messages from vendors. Elena organized everything else. The fake contract, property records, Northline Holdings documents, and old emails her father had saved. By the time the sky began to lighten, she had fallen asleep at the table, her head resting on her arms. I gently placed a blanket over her shoulders, looking at her there. Surrounded by evidence that could bring down a powerful man, I realized this was no longer just about a stranger who knocked on my door in the rain. It was about something bigger. Truth, power, and people who had been silenced for too long. For the first time in 3 years, I wanted to win, not for revenge, for a future. After we sent the initial evidence to Grace, things escalated quickly. She forwarded everything to the county prosecutor. A few days later, I received a call from a state investigator named Daniel Pierce. His voice was cautious, measured. He said the evidence was strong enough to continue, but not enough yet for a full warrant, especially not without the hard drive. We were running out of time, because Salazar already knew we were building a case. And then, 3 days later, he struck hard. I woke up at around 4 a.m. to the sound of cattle panicking. I rushed outside. The south gate had been thrown wide open. The electric fence was cut clean through. The entire herd was scattered across the pasture near the highway. One of the cows had a deep cut on her leg, tangled in broken wire. And across the barn door, bright red spray paint spelled out a message: "Drop her off or lose everything." Elena ran out behind me and froze instantly when she saw it. "Connor!" I turned toward her. Her face was completely drained of color. "Go inside," I said. "No," she replied immediately. "I'm helping." "Elena!" She stepped forward, voice steady despite shaking hands. "I'm not hiding while he destroys everything you built." So we worked in the dark. I called Mr. Coleman, and he arrived without hesitation. Elena took the ATV for the first time, unsteady but determined, trying to steer the scattered cattle away from the road. I wrapped the injured cow's leg as best I could and called a vet. By sunrise, we were exhausted, covered in mud, but the herd was still alive. Mr. Coleman stared at the message on the barn. "This isn't harassment anymore," he said grimly. "This is escalation. Call the state police." Now, I already had. By midday, investigator Daniel Pierce arrived. He photographed everything, collected paint samples, examined the cut wires, and pulled footage from the backup cameras. One camera hidden in an apple tree had captured a silver pickup, leaving at 3:17 a.m. The plate was partially covered in mud, but the logo of Salazar's transport company was clearly visible. Daniel nodded slowly. "This is solid." Elena asked quietly, "Is it enough for the house search?" He paused. "I'll push for the warrant today." But Salazar didn't wait. That afternoon, my phone rang. I put it on speaker. His voice was calm, almost friendly. "Connor, you should manage Ms. Mendoza better. She's becoming quite a problem." I replied coldly, "You're the one destroying my ranch." A soft laugh. "Be careful. False accusations can become very expensive." Elena stepped closer to the phone. "Richard, this is ending." Silence on the line. Then his voice turned sharper. "Elena, still think you matter in this? You're just the daughter of a man who failed." Her hand shook, but her voice didn't break. "No," she said. "I'm the person still alive to tell the truth." Another pause, then cold anger. "If you think a few papers can stop me, you're just like your father, naive." The call ended. Elena stood there trembling, trying to stay steady. I walked over and took her hands. "Are you okay?" She looked up at me, and that's when I realized I had called her by her name without thinking. She noticed it too. The space between us shifted. "I'm scared," she said quietly, "but I don't want to run anymore." "Then don't," I said. "I'm here." She searched my face. "You've already lost so much because of me." "No," I said. "I've started getting something back because of you." She shook her head softly. "Don't say that unless you mean it." I stepped closer. "Elena, I don't know exactly when it happened. Maybe the night you showed up in the rain. Maybe when you were chasing chickens through the mud. Maybe when you sat here piecing everything together, even when you were exhausted. But I know I love you." She froze. "Connor, you don't have to answer," I said quickly. "I just needed you to know. This isn't pity. It's not responsibility. It's a choice." Tears ran down her face. "I love you too," she whispered. I tried not to. I thought I would only bring destruction into your life. But every time you stood between me and fear, I started believing I could live again. I pulled her into my arms. The kiss wasn't perfect. It wasn't cinematic. It happened in a tired kitchen after a long day, both of us covered in dust, sweat, and exhaustion. But it was real, and it didn't erase Maria. And it didn't erase her past. It simply meant two broken people had chosen not to be alone anymore. That night, Daniel called again. "We've got the warrant. Tomorrow we search the Mendoza property." "I'm going with her," I said. A pause. "I expected that," he replied. The next morning, we drove to Oregon with Daniel, Grace, and 2 investigators. The house stood abandoned at the end of a tree-lined road, windows boarded, yard swallowed by weeds. Elena stopped at the gate, gripping my hand tightly. "I grew up here," she said quietly, "before everything was taken." I squeezed her hand back. "Then today we take something back." Inside, everything was covered in dust and silence. She led us straight to her father's office. Under a loose floorboard, exactly where she remembered, we found a metal box. Inside it was a hard drive, copies of contracts, handwritten notes, and detailed transaction records linking Salazar, Northline Holdings, local banks, and multiple forced land sales. Grace opened her laptop immediately. Her expression changed as she scanned the files. "Oh my God," she whispered. "This isn't just one case, this is an entire system." Daniel stepped outside immediately to make a call. And in the middle of the room, Elena stood silently, tears falling, but for the first time, not from fear, I stayed right beside her. "Your father didn't lose his life for nothing," I said quietly. She turned toward me. "And your mother made sure the right things were hidden." That afternoon, Salazar was officially summoned, but instead of waiting quietly, he tried to control the narrative. He held a rushed press statement in town, claiming he was a target of a coordinated smear campaign, that Elena was emotionally unstable after her father's death, and that I was simply a struggling rancher she had manipulated into a false story. But things were already moving faster than he could manage. Daniel and the prosecutor pushed forward immediately. Search warrants expanded, financial accounts were frozen, and slowly, people who had worked under Salazar started speaking. One truck driver admitted he had been paid to cut fences and release livestock on my property. An accountant came forward with emails showing Salazar was fully aware the wife contract was fabricated from the very beginning. By evening, the news was already spreading through the county. Richard Salazar had been arrested. I was standing near the cattle pen with Elena when the call came through. A soft wind moved across the dry fields, carrying the smell of earth after recent rain. Elena looked at me, her voice barely steady. "Is it over?" I shook my head slowly. "Not fully. There will still be court hearings, investigations, paperwork, a long road ahead. But he doesn't get to control your life anymore." She leaned slightly into me. "I don't even know how to live when I'm not running." I looked across the ranch, the half-repaired fences, the barn still faintly smelling of smoke, the fields waiting for spring to return. "Then we learn," I said. "We learn how to stay." The investigation stretched on for months. Salazar wasn't just charged with forging documents or threatening Elena. He was connected to a wider web: illegal land acquisitions, coercive loan manipulation, property damage cases, and money laundering through a supply chain and transport business. Once word got out that he had been arrested, others began stepping forward too. Farmers who had lost barns in accidental fires, ranchers whose water systems had mysteriously failed, families whose loans were suddenly called in after paperwork was quietly altered. It became clear my ranch had never been his only target, just one of the smaller ones he believed he could break without attention. This time, he miscalculated. Elena testified in court. I sat behind her as she stood before the judge, the same woman who once stood shaking on my porch in the rain, now speaking clearly, steadily, one truth at a time. She told everything: her father's case, the forged documents, the night she ran to my ranch, and everything that followed afterward. Salazar's lawyer tried to destabilize her testimony. He questioned her emotions, suggested she had feelings for me, tried to imply she was exaggerating the situation. Elena didn't flinch. She looked directly at him and said calmly, "Yes, I love Connor Walker, but my feelings do not create forged signatures. They do not cut fences. They do not poison water systems or build shell companies. Those actions were committed by your client." The courtroom went completely silent. I had to lower my head slightly to hide the fact I was smiling. In the end, Salazar was found guilty. His assets were seized and redirected toward compensating the people he had harmed. A portion of Elena's family land was also legally returned to her. She could have sold it, walked away, or rebuilt her life somewhere else entirely. But for several days, I didn't bring it up. I didn't want her to feel tied to me or the ranch out of obligation. One afternoon in early spring, I found her in the barn while repairing a damaged cattle pen door. She leaned against the doorway, holding a folder. "I've made my decision about the land," she said. I set the hammer down slowly. "All right." She walked closer. "I'm keeping a small part where my mother is buried. The rest, I want to turn into a support fund for small ranchers affected by Salazar. Grace says we can build a legal and financial structure to protect others from contracts like this." I looked at her carefully. I wasn't surprised. Elena was never the type to turn pain into control over others. She wanted to turn it into protection. "And you?" I asked. "Where do you want to go?" She looked around: barn, fields, fences, dirt road, the old truck parked near the gate. "Here," she said simply. I stayed quiet. She continued. "Not because I have nowhere else. Not because I need protection. Because I'm choosing it." I stepped closer. "Elaine, are you sure? This place isn't easy. Nothing about it is. There are broken things, hard winters, debt, exhaustion, and mornings you'll wish you didn't wake up so early." She gave a small smile. "I've already lived through the hard parts, and I still want this place." "Why?" I asked. She looked at me without hesitation. "Because it's the first place where I wasn't treated like something to be owned, traded, or fixed. Here I learned how to work, how to laugh, how to stand still instead of running." She paused. "And because you're here." For a moment, I couldn't respond. Then I reached into my jacket pocket and took out a small box. Not expensive, not flashy, just a simple silver ring I had bought using savings from selling calves and repairing equipment for neighbors. "I used to think the night you arrived changed everything," I said, "because someone said you were sent to be my wife. I hated that sentence because it made you sound like something decided for you." I took a breath and stepped down onto one knee right there in the barn. "So I want to ask properly. Elena Mendoza, will you marry me? Not because of any contract, not because of fear, not because you have nowhere else to go, but because you choose me and I choose you." Elena broke into tears, but this time they weren't fear. They were relief. "Yes," she said softly, "I choose you." The wedding took place on the ranch that summer. It was simple. No luxury hall, no expensive decorations, just long wooden tables set in the yard. Mr. Coleman hung string lights across the barn. Grace officiated the ceremony. Daniel Pierce showed up with a cheap bottle of wine and joked that it was the most peaceful case-ending celebration he had ever attended. Farmers who had also suffered under Salazar came too, bringing food, bread, flowers, and stories, not just to celebrate, but to witness that fear had finally ended. Elena wore a simple white dress. Her hair was loose with small flowers tucked in. As she walked across the yard, wind moving to the fields and cattle calling in the distance, I remember the first night she arrived. Soaked, shaking, saying she had been sent. Now she was walking toward me on her own terms. In my vows, I said, "I thought my life ended with the past, but you didn't replace anything. You reminded me that life continues even after loss. I will never see you as someone I rescued. You are the reason I learned how to live again." Elena held my hands tightly. "I lost everything once," she said, voice steady but emotional. "My home, my name, my safety, my control over my own life. But you gave me something no one can take or force the choice. And today, I choose you. I choose this ranch. I choose every hard morning, every muddy field, every broken fence, every winter that feels too long. I choose to stay, not because I have to, but because this is home." After the wedding, life didn't suddenly become easy. The ranch still needed work. Debt still existed. Machines still broke. Weather still ruined plans. But the house felt different. On the kitchen whiteboard, the list of chores remained. But now there were new notes in Elena's handwriting by tomato seeds. "Call Grace about the ranch support fund. Remind Connor to rest." A year later, the ranch slowly began to heal. We opened a small weekend stand, selling eggs, goat milk, vegetables, and bread. Elena learned to bake herself. She even built a simple website for orders from town. But she never let it become something artificial or polished. It was still real, still us, still the land, the animals, the mornings, the wind, and the smell of coffee in the kitchen. One evening, Elena sat on the wooden rocking chair I had built for her on the porch. She looked across the fields. I stood beside the railing, watching the sun drop behind the hills. "Do you still remember the night I arrived?" she asked. "I remember everything," I said. "Back then, I thought my life was over," she said. I looked at her. "And now," she smiled softly, "now I think it's just beginning." I sat beside her. The wind moved across the fields, carrying the scent of fresh hay. The cattle were calm in the distance. The fence line, the one that had been broken so many times, stood strong again. I used to think this ranch held everything I had lost, I said. Elena rested her head on my shoulder. And now, I looked at the house glowing behind us, then at her hand in mine. Now it's where everything we chose lives.